Okay, so Shabbat Shalom. Shabbat Shalom. And so I'm very pleased to have with us here a guest who is our volunteer guest, who is my sister. But more important than that, Caine Kreinin is an associate curator at the Israel Museum in Yerushalayim. And you occasionally tell me about the amazing things that you look at and you do at the museum. And I thought this is a perfect opportunity to bring this over now that we're doing a whole series leading up to Tisha B'Av and to the story of destruction. And that's pretty much the time you deal with, Nachon?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So you're the person to talk to. So thank you very much for volunteering your time. And maybe you can give us at the beginning 2 or 3 minutes, just introduction about who you are, a bit about your previous exhibitions at the university, at the museum, and then we'll go into this subject. So that.
Okay. Perfect. So, like Gila said, I work in the Israel Museum for the past 14 odd years. And I work with the chief curator who's in charge of the classical periods, which means Hellenistic, Roman, and Byzantine periods. And these are basically the time frame. This is basically the time frame for the Second Temple period's destruction, Tisha B'Av, and the aftermath of the first revolt, which is the Bar Kokhba revolt. So death and destruction is my territory. A few exhibitions I took part in and did in the past few years have been actually quite relevant to this topic. We did in 2013, we did a huge exhibition about King Herod the Great, and I'll touch a little bit about King Herod in this presentation. And the last exhibition I did actually had absolutely nothing to do with this topic. It was an exhibition called From Pan to Peter Pan, and it was the story of basically how the god Pan found its way into 19th century England and into the story, into children's storybooks, and specifically into the story of Peter Pan, and how the two characters actually lend from each other and create and change each other's world. And this adoption took place in the 19th century as part of this reaction to the industrialization and the destruction of nature, which took part in England at the time. And British artists actually reclaimed or brought to life ancient gods as a way to reconnect with nature. And one of the leading gods was obviously Pan, who was one of the greatest deities, nature deities in the Greco-Roman culture. And so that was the background for the story. And if you go on the Israel Museum site, you can actually see a little bit about, a little bit more about the exhibitions. There's a timeline with all of the names of the exhibitions, and if anything catches your interest, you can kind of delve into it. Okay, so I think we'll start. Yeah, let's start. Before I begin, just to preface, it's not a monologue. So if you have any questions or if you'd like me to expand, elaborate on something, please feel free completely to stop me and yeah, ask me questions. It's an open mic. Okay, so Gila asked me to share with you some of the artifacts which deal with the destruction of the temple, the Great Revolt, and the Bar Kokhba revolt. And it's interesting because when I look at our galleries, though they do center around the revolts and the destruction of Judea, the destruction of the land of Israel in general by the Greeks and later the Romans, what we stress and what we usually see in our galleries is actually not the culmination or the destruction, but actually the syncretism and the assimilation that took place within this country, the artifacts that you're going to see. And if you look in general in the Greco-Roman world, you can see that much of what you can see is actually a product of the shared culture, or what they saw in each other, the mutual attraction that the Jews felt towards the Romans and the Greeks, and vice versa. The great attraction that Rome felt towards Israel, and that Rome felt towards the East in general. This whole process, do you see the presentation? Is it okay? You see the slides? Perfect. This whole process started, of course, with Alexander the Great. This is a statue that comes from Beth She'an here in Israel, shown obviously in our galleries. Alexander brought a new worldview, you could say, of what it means to be a conqueror, what it means to be an empire. When he conquered the East, he came with a lot of respect and a lot of admiration to the great cultures that were living in this area. And he wanted to assimilate, he wanted to adopt many of these ancient gods into his own cult, and he created this new Hellenistic syncretism, as it's called. It's not to mean that he was this cuddly bear. His conquests were very brutal and very uncompromising, but his view, his eye was to the East, and he viewed this adoption of the local cult as a sort of form of, as a means for acculturation. He used his own cult and the foreign cults and the melding of them both as a means for promoting his worldview. The Romans, of course, continued this train of thought, or this way of behaving when they conquered, when they left the borders of Attica, when they left the borders of Rome and ventured into the East, when they set out to become, to change from a republic to an empire. Rome was overflooded with people from the East, whether it be slaves brought from the conquered nations, but also freedmen, artists, philosophers, artisans, just regular people, travelers, salesmen. The capacity or the level of homogeneity that existed before the conquests completely changed. Rome became this hub, this cosmopolitan hub, and Romans had to start reevaluating who they actually are in opposition to all of these foreign people who, we think today of the change that immigration has on our countries. And if you think of the opposition, the attraction, the interest we find in foreign cultures coming into our culture, and also the fear that we have, the fear that we sense, loss of identity, loss of our own personal culture in opposition to these entering cultures. All of this existed in the ancient world, and we're used to thinking of Rome as this mighty empire who subjugated all of their cultures, all of these cultures. But Rome itself was subjugated, and they feared and were attracted much the same way as the conquered nations did. When it came to the Jews, the problem was even greater. And you see here this text by Euphrates, who was a counselor to the Emperor Vespasian, and he says the Jews for some time now have been at odds, not just with Rome, but with humanity, for a nation whose existence is separate and irreconcilable, a nation who cannot share with humanity the pleasures of dining, who cannot take part in sacrifice or prayer, is separated from us by a deeper chasm than that which separates us from Shushan or India. So when it came to Judaism, there was a bigger problem because we were obviously monotheistic, so there was no option for syncretism. When you think of the Roman pantheon, it was completely syncretized with a Greek pantheon. All of the gods we know of Rome, the great gods of Rome, Dionysus, Aphrodite, these are all gods from the East that were assimilated into Rome. We can do that. They had no connection with us. They had no way of connecting with us. And another thing that was problematic is that, of course, we were aniconic. We had no sculptures. We were not allowed to view sculptures as divinities, and that was the base for a Roman cult. Roman cult is not theological; it's material. Sacrifice to the gods, sacrifice to the statues, the work, the divine work with the statues. This is the base for Roman cult. We had no connection, and that caused a deep rift between us. They respected Judaism, they respected the ancient God of Israel, who they tried to assimilate or tried to syncretize with Jupiter, who is the main Roman god. And like they did with every conquered nation, they wanted to take upon themselves the cult of the conquered. They wanted to take upon themselves Judaism in a way, a Romanized form of Judaism, but obviously we couldn't do that. We couldn't take part in that. So there was a very, very deep and innate separateness from Rome. And on the other hand, as you will see from all of the artifacts that I'll show you today, like I said before, there was mutual adoption, mutual interest, mutual appreciation. The story obviously begins with Hadrian, Hadrian later. Herod the Great was born in 73 CE. Israel was conquered, the land of Israel was conquered in 63 CE. So Herod was born before that. He was born in the time of the Hasmonean rule. And if you remember your history class, the war of the Hasmoneans, the Maccabees, the story for Hanukkah happened in 163 CE. So this is a time Herod was born in a time when the land was under Jewish rule. It was a time of autonomy from any oppressing rulers, foreign rulers. But he was born to an Nabatean, an Arab mother, and an Edomian father. Now, the Edomites, many of them were forced into Judaism. They were forced by the Hasmonean to accept Judaism. Something we're not used to thinking when we think of Judaism, but Jews in the land of Israel enforced Judaism on Gentiles sometimes. So he was born a Jew, halachically, but his Judaism was seen as kind of iffy. He was raised in the Hasmonean court. His father was an official, Hasmonean official, and he, from an early age, showed great promise as a politician. He was very shrewd, very brutal, very smart, very imaginative. And in 40 CE, the Roman Augustus of the time, the Emperor Augustus, his wife Livia, his right-hand man Agrippa, they all became very, very close friends with Herod, and they appointed him as king of Judea. And the first thing he did was kill the Hasmonean king, and he became sole ruler of the land. And what he tried to do throughout his rule was syncretize Rome and the Roman culture that he adored into the local culture. And he constantly tried to mediate between the different factions in the country. And he created a very stable, a very prosperous country, quite rich. You may have heard of all of his enormous building projects for which he is perhaps most well known for. This is the Mount of Masada, and you can see this insane cliff on which he perched his palaces. We have other palaces in throughout the country, the palace in Jerusalem, the palace in Kairos. He had dozens of palaces and fortresses throughout the country. He built, for example, the harbor at Caesarea, which completely changed commerce, not just in Israel, but throughout the Mediterranean basin. This became one of the leading harbors at the time, except for Alexandria. This was the competing harbor for Alexandria. So it completely changed not just the commerce, but the type of material, the type of goods that people in the land could find, the type of food. All of a sudden you had food from delicacies coming from Rome, coming from Egypt, coming from Greece. He completely changed the face of the land. He brought different techniques, styles, architecture, technology. For example, the bathhouse culture, which was so prevalent and so fundamental in the Roman culture. He brought it into the country. This is the first time we see a Roman bath, and if any of you have been in Europe, if you've been to Italy or any of the places in Europe, if you've seen a Roman bath, it's exactly the same everywhere you go. You have this raised floor. There was a furnace in the adjacent room, and the furnace would pump hot air underneath the floor, and it would basically create this beautiful sauna. Very, very important culture that Herod brought into the country. You see here this beautiful bathtub. It's huge. It can sit about 2 or 3 people quite comfortably. It was exhibited in our Herod exhibition, which you see here in the background. He brought not just artisans, but also materials, physical pigments, which he used, which Augustus sent him, especially from his own pigment mines in Italy. For example, the cinnabar, which is this red, beautiful, dark red pigment. This is a pigment that only Augustus had, and he sent this cinnabar to his friend Herod. And this room is a theater room in Herodium, which is one of the sites, one of the palaces that Herod built. And we know that this room actually entertained Agrippa himself, when he came to visit his friend Herod here in the country. This is one of the frescoes that we reconstructed for the Herod exhibition. It's made up of tiny, tiny, tiny little fragments. There were tens of thousands of little fragments, which our poor restoration lab had to sort through for months. And they finally reconstructed not just this, but an entire room of frescoes, which we exhibited in the exhibition. But it shows this Nilotic scene with sort of trompe-l'oeil hanging windows. You can see the nail and the string that hangs the picture. Really beautiful artwork that mimics exactly what we see in this time period in Italy and in Greece. So he turned Israel, he turned Judea into, or he made it sort of on par with the Greco-Roman world. He Romanized the country. I'm telling you all of this because the Jerusalem that's destroyed in 70 CE is fully Romanized. It's not separate from the Roman world in any way, shape, or form. The people living in the upper part of Jerusalem, which is this area, what I showed you here is a model of a Jerusalem late Second Temple period Jerusalem, year 66. It's a 1:60 model of Jerusalem, so it's huge. You can see the people here in the background. It's a really big model, and it shows Jerusalem in the time of its destruction. And you can see the lower area of Jerusalem where all of the middle classes and the lower classes lived. And then up here you see the area, the upper part of Jerusalem, where the wealthier, the more affluent people, the priestly families lived. And most of the priestly families obviously worked in this area, which is the Temple Mount. We had kirkusim, we had theaters, amphitheaters, stadia, all of the attractions, the entertainment forms that you found in Rome, in Greece, you found them here. Fun fact, they didn't actually discover the theatre itself, because this area was heavily built by the time the excavations took place, and they couldn't really excavate this area. But they did find a theatre ticket made of stone. I couldn't find a picture of it because COVID-19, so I didn't have access to my computer at work. But interesting. So just different images of Upper Jerusalem at the time. You see Ionic capitals, Corinthian capitals, this restoration of what a house looked like in Second Temple period, an affluent house, of course, a priestly family house, and it's exactly what you would find in Pompeii, Herculaneum, any of the sites you would see in the Greco-Roman world at this period, we found here. The only difference being, of course, that they adhered to the Jewish laws. So they weren't fully Romanized. Obviously, there was always this give and take, this sort of pendulum swing between accepting Rome and maintaining their own identity. Just as Rome struggled to maintain its own identity, the Jews obviously tried to maintain their identity, and one of the things is, as I mentioned, an iconism. So there are no graven images. You won't find any images except for in the private rooms in Herod's residence. And if you remember the image I showed you before of the hanging picture, it had cows and people in the background, but that's something we only find in the private quarters of Herod's palaces. The people of Jerusalem, the people of Judea, refrain from any graven image, and you only find geometric styled mosaic floors, such as this one from, it's called the Burnt House in the old quarter of Jerusalem. It was burned down in the destruction, hence the name.
Sorry, yeah. There's just a question here. So I'm looking at the chat and there's a question. Robert asks if there, you said circuses, and he asks if there were gladiators in Jerusalem at the time.
Probably yes, but we're not sure. We know that the Chazal spoke up against it. They spoke against both gladiators, and they spoke up against the theater culture, actors, pantomime. So we presume it existed, but we don't know to what extent. We know that they were Jewish gladiators. We know that from Rome, but we don't know anything about that in Israel. But we know the culture existed. Definitely the theater culture. Gladiators, not sure. I don't see the comments, by the way, for some reason. So if there are any comments, either just speak up, or Gila, if you could just interrupt me every once in a while.
I'll do that. And people are welcome to unmute if they have questions and ask questions.
So no graven image, geometric style. Another interesting thing that we find, this shows us the typical, again, it's from our gallery, it shows us the typical sort of utensils that people would use at the time, not just the affluent, just your everyday kitchenware. These are called terra sigillata, stamped earth, terra, earth, sigillata, stamped. And these were actually imports from Greece and Rome, this redware. And what you see next to it is the local material made of stone. These are probably natlot, used for natilat yadayim. And stone was perceived as a material which does not attract impurities. Strangely enough, because it's really porous and it attracts anything. But for some reason, it was perceived as pure. And these are made from the local local Jerusalem stone, kirton, which is really, really soft and easy to manipulate. And you see just these two living together, the tersitilata, the imports, next to the local kosher material. One of the greatest projects, obviously, that Herod undertook, one of the greatest projects that he undertook was obviously the building of the Temple Mount. What he did was basically take the old temple that was built by Shevet Zion, the Jews returning from the Babylonian exile in 516. This temple was renovated by the Hasmoneans, and what he did was take this ancient temple and redo it completely. He created this huge platform, this huge plateau, which tripled the size of the Temple Mount, and he created these huge retaining walls, which you see around this colonnade. The Wailing Wall, the Western Wall, is obviously a tiny little part of the Temple Mount. And he created basically a temenos. Temenos is a Greco-Roman format for a pagan temple. Every pagan temple, a large-scale one, would have a temenos where people could congregate. The colonnades would serve for secular activities. We know of this royal basilica, which was this beautiful basilica. You see here a reconstruction with Corinthian capitals, which were coated in gold, with gold leaf. And this royal basilica, if any of you remember the verse from the New Testament, you know the scene when Jesus calls out the priests for turning the God's house into a whorehouse. He's talking about the money launderers. This is where the people would change their Tyre, Sidon, the area Tyre, north of Syria, modern day Syria. They would change their Syrian coins for Jewish shkalim, and this is the half shekel that every Jewish man was supposed to give as donation to the temple. This is where this would happen. So this whole area, this was also where the Sanhedrin would sit and judge the people. So what Herod did was basically take the most sacred, the sacredest place for Judaism, and maintain the sacredness and maintain the Jewish, adhere to the Jewish laws of the temple, but he enveloped it in this Greco-Roman format, which changed obviously the way that people viewed the temple and viewed the way they behaved in the temple or in its surrounding. He did it, of course, with the utmost respect, and he had this huge, this long speech which he gave to the people just before he started doing this renovation of the temple, and he promised them that the work in the temple, we know all of this, of course, from Josephus Flavius. He promised them that the daily work of the temple would not be stopped, not even for a day. And we know that this project, the people who took part, the workers who took part in this project, were the priests themselves, as well as builders from all across the land and abroad, which came, and it became one of the most splendid temples in all of the Greco-Roman world. It was known far and wide, and it was a great source of pride for the Jews of Judea, and even Chazal, you know how this saying, "He who has never seen the temple standing has never seen a magnificent building." You probably know this line, but it really was a source of pride. And unfortunately, this temple, by the time they finished building it, it was destroyed. So it didn't really have a long shelf life, unfortunately. It wasn't excavated because the Waqf, the Muslim Waqf, is actually in charge of the Temple Mount today. So Israeli archaeologists couldn't excavate the Temple Mount, but some of the artifacts from the Temple Mount actually found their way, because of the destruction. Us archaeologists, we love destruction, found their way to what we call Wall Street, which is the wall or the street just below the Temple Mount wall. And some of these artifacts are either the architecture that came from this huge temenos and basilica, and that's how we know to reconstruct the Temple Mount from all of the artifacts that we found on this Wall Street, but also some other items which are really interesting and have a more sort of emotional side to them. We have this incised menorah, which was found in a priestly home in the upper parts of Jerusalem. So this was probably done by a priest or someone who had access to the inner sanctum of the temple, and it's one of the earliest depictions we have of the Jewish menorah from the temple. Another item we have is this parapet fragment, which has the inscription to the place of trumpeting, and this is basically where the priest would stand at the beginning and the end of Shabbat to declare with the trumpet the beginning and the end of the holy day. And if any of you have been to Jerusalem, you know that this custom still exists today. At the beginning of Shabbat, we have a siren that goes off and declares the entrance of Shabbat. So this is where it started. Another item which we have exhibited in our galleries is this prohibition of entry to the temple grounds for Gentiles. And it was this inscription was multiplied all around the inner area of the temple, which was for Jews only, and it was written in Latin, in Greek, and in Hebrew, in Aramaic. So anyone who came could be able to read, and anyone who crossed the parapet or crossed the partition was executed or could be executed. Another item we have, which is very interesting, is an ossuary or a bone box, and it has the name of the deceased on it. It says Simon Bonei Haichal or Bonei Heichalo, Simon, builder of the temple. So this is probably one of the workers, perhaps a priest, who took part in Herod's building project. The whole concept of burial in ossuaries is also something which appears in this time in the late Second Temple period. We don't know exactly where this tradition came from, but it's a very interesting burial practice which appears in this time frame and disappears as soon as the temple disappears. And one of the ideas is that this is actually another example of syncretism, another example of the Jewish adoption of Greco-Roman modes of thought, the idea of an afterlife, the idea of Tchiyat HaMetim as the Tchiyat HaMetim of a single person. In the first temple period, you have what's called a ma'asefah, which is basically a sort of a communal or a family burial plot. And they would just shove all of the bones of the deceased into one ma'asefah, into one plot. In this period, you suddenly have individualized burial, which speaks of a different perception or a different view of the afterlife and of Tchiyat HaMetim. And that is probably a result of Hellenistic influence that came to the country in the Hasmonean period and flourished during this period. Jerusalem in the Second Temple period, as you probably know, was a rift society with very with lots of cults and sects and a lot of inner bickering. And you probably know all the stories. And of course, one of the main sects that appeared at this period of time is, of course, Christianity, which was born in this period. And we have some of the main artifacts which pertain to Christianity. We have the inscription naming Pontius Pilatus, who was a procurator of Judea, and who was charged with the crucifixion of Jesus. And of course, we have the ossuary, again, this beautiful bone box of Caiaphas, who was the high priest who handed Jesus to Pontius Pilate. Another thing we have is the sole evidence for crucifixion ever discovered in the world. Strangely enough, when you think of all of the tens of thousands of people who were crucified, there is no archaeological evidence for that crucifixion. This is actually the only one. This was the ossuary of a young man called Yochanan, son of Chadakul, who was crucified. We don't know why, but it's interesting. When Herod died, the prosperity and the stability that Judea knew in his time was gone. His sons, his heirs, were not able to maintain the same level of the same amicable relationship with Rome, and things turned sour pretty quickly. We had Pontius Pilate and other procurators who ruled Judea instead of the Jewish kings, and their time of rule was very oppressive. Judea was viewed as an ally in the time of Herod, legally.
Sorry, 1 second. Yeah. It's just still a question about the ossuaries, so I'm going to ask. Yeah. I'm going to bring it up. There's a question of how big were they? How big are these boxes? Okay. And maybe you can say just something short about how the burial, like, do you put the whole body inside, or how does it work?
Okay. So first of all, they were bought. They had workshops for ossuaries, so you didn't just prepare your own ossuary. Just like today, you buy an ossuary when someone dies. The only thing that the family would do for the deceased was write the name on it, and sometime, just like today, his profession, something personal. We have in our storerooms, for example, an ossuary that says Ima. So it's someone's mother who died. So we have her name and her title, Ima. She was a mom. So what happened is that when a person died, he was laid in a family plot. His body was laid down, and it was left there to rot for a year. And then after a year, the family would come back, open the burial plot, collect the bones, and instead of putting it in this massive this family plot, it was placed in an ossuary. The size of these ossuaries depended on the size of the man, the size of the person. So you have, if it was a child or a baby, they're quite small. The length is determined by the longest, the width of the skull, and the length of the hip bone, which is the longest bone in the body. So that's the size of the ossuary, and you would buy the size you needed, and they changed. You could buy a very, very basic. For example, this is a very basic one. He was probably not an affluent. He probably wasn't rich. The family probably just bought a regular ossuary off the shelf. Obviously, the ossuary of Caiaphas is a very high quality ossuary made of beautiful stone, beautifully carved. But again, they always adhere to the non-figurative, to the commandment of lo taset tselem. So it's always geometric or architectonic, architectural. What was the other question? The size, the style,
and how the practice of burying. So yeah, you answered that.
Okay, so I covered those. Okay. Okay. So The year 66 comes. Jerusalem is in a bad shape by this time because there's a terrible rift between the procurators and the people living in Judea. They're oppressed. There's a great threat to Jewish life in general, a great hostility between the Jewish towns and the mixed towns, because Israel consisted of both almost completely Jewish settlements and mixed towns, more cosmopolitan towns. And the Jewish towns became more and more, what's the word? What's the word? Kitzoni. Sorry, I'm forgetting my English.
Radicalized.
Yeah. The Great Revolt starts in 66, but it took years of preparation beforehand. All of Judea was, they used underground tunnels, and a lot of the area underneath Jerusalem and underneath Judea in general has lots of these tunnels, and they would stash food, armor, whatever they could find, whatever they could use. It was a very well organized revolt, and that's why also it took such a long time. You can see the date 66 to 73. That's years of an ongoing war. And we see today in the world what an ongoing war of years looks like at the end of it and during it. So it was no small undertaking. Rome is very powerful at the time, quite stable. So standing up against Rome with this messianic hope of redemption, messianic hope of re-establishing Jewish dominion. They're thinking back to the Hasmonean time, the Hasmonean revolt of 163. They're thinking of that and trying to reclaim the land. And all of the iconography they use, for example, on their coins, is actually iconography that's borrowed from the Hasmonean time. They're using the same slogans: Jerusalem, the Holy Jerusalem, for the restoration of Jerusalem, and so on. The Romans also meant their own coins, and their coins are obviously the coins of the subjugation. You probably know the Judea Capta coins, Judea captured. For the Great Revolt, the Revolt of 66, we have Josephus Flavius, who gives us a wonderful and horrifying, very in-depth and detailed description of what exactly took place during these years in Judea, and we're very lucky to have him, obviously. And I chose to bring this quite horrible description. As the legions charged in, this is the moment when the Romans, the year is 70, they siege Jerusalem for 4 months, and we hear horrendous descriptions of a terrible famine that took place in this time in Jerusalem. Obviously, there was no way of bringing food into the town, and people started dying just from hunger alone. And the walls come tumbling down in 70 CE. As the legions charged in, Passion alone was in command. Crowded together around the entrances, many were trampled by their brethren. Many fell among the still hot and smoking ruins of the colonnades and died as miserably as the defeated. Everywhere was slaughter and flight. Most of the victims were peaceful citizens, weak and unarmed, butchered wherever they were caught. Round the altar, heaps of corpses grew higher and higher, while down the sanctuary steps poured rivers of blood, and the bodies of those killed at the top slithered to the bottom. Yikes. Judea was razed to the ground. The temple was razed. They left nothing behind them. Everyone was expelled, either expelled, killed, or sold into slavery. Some lucky ones managed to flee to the Galilee and to southern Judea, and there they restarted to build Judaism, to rebuild their lives. retaining in a miraculous way, or in a, well, it depends how you look at it, but they managed to retain this idea of redemption, and that leads us to the Bar Kokhba revolt. But we know that the numbers and the severity with which the Romans defeated this revolt was exceptional, even in Roman standards, and their standards were quite low to begin with. But what they did here in Judea was shocking, even for the Roman world. We know that the price, there was an inflation in the price of slaves at this time, because there were so many slaves from Judea. This is the Colosseum, which was actually built by Jewish slaves using money from the campaigns, using money from plunder that was taken from Judea. So they have the Colosseum. They have to thank us for the Colosseum. One of the last strongholds that was left was Masada. And you have here the description of Elazar ben Yair. Again, we have this story of mass suicide that took place on the eve, probably before the Romans managed to break through this fortress. We hear of a mass suicide, people killing each other, hoping to save their family from enslavement to Rome. Now, we don't know if this mass suicide took place or if it was just literature. But archaeologists didn't find any evidence on the mount itself for any fight. A few arrowheads, but nothing nothing that compares with the description that Josephus tells us. We would have expected to find hundreds or at least tens of human remains on the mount. Nothing was found. What they did find are these remains of three young people, a baby and two probably children, the braids, a brush, and a comb. And this is actually a Roman legionary's skirt, which was probably taken by the young man, or at least that's the idea. Are these some of the people that took refuge on Mitzada, were killed? We really don't know, but these are the only remnants that we have of this terrible story. What we do know is that Judea was changed forever after this revolt and after the destruction that ensued. And yet in 132, so it's just about 60 years later, so the grandparents are still alive, they still remember what happened, they still remember the wrath of Rome, and somehow they still have this messianic idea, and they're led by Bar Kokhba. Rome at this time is at the height of its power. It's the 2nd century. Hadrian is in charge. He's remembered as one, in Roman eyes, he's remembered as one of the noblest, one of the most educated, cultured, the kindest emperors, the most stable emperors that Rome has ever known. And yet, obviously in Jewish thought, he's referred to as the bone grinder. We know that when he came to Judea, he actually came to visit. He was known as a traveling emperor, and he came to Judea to inspect the state of Judea. He came in peace in 130 CE. And he wanted to rebuild what Titus did. He wanted to rebuild the city of Jerusalem, this ancient, beautiful city of the Eastern world, and he wanted to rebuild the temple for the Jewish God, who was, like I said at the beginning, revered and appreciated in Greco-Roman thought as an ancient god, which you shouldn't mess with. And they wanted to rebuild the temple, but they did it in a syncretized way, obviously. and they wanted to syncretize our god with Jupiter. Obviously, that didn't go down well with the Jews, and neither did the re-establishment of Judea or Jerusalem as Aelia Capitolina, named after Hadrian himself, and the Capitoline deities, the deities of the Capitoline in Rome, and all of his endeavors to found this new Judeo-Roman city were viewed as an act of hostility towards Judaism and towards Judea. You see here a coin commemorating his arrival, and he's welcomed here by the Jewish province, who is actually sacrificing to the Augustus. And we know of an inscription. Jerusalem at this point in time is actually ruled by the 10th Legion, who after the first revolt, the Great Revolt, set camp on the Temple Mount. The Temple Mount becomes a legionary camp for the Roman soldiers, and they welcome him. They welcome the Imperator into the city, and the Jews go berserk. They're led by Bar Kokhba. Unlike the first revolt, we don't have Josephus Flavius, so we don't have a lot of written or historical sources to explain exactly what took place in these periods. But what we do have are a few, quite a lot actually, of letters, papyri, and wooden letters, which were actually written by Bar Kokhba himself and his officials. They exchange letters between themselves. We have coins, and we have other sources, historical sources, which tell us a lot about who this Bar Kokhba was. They tell us a lot about his character, but not where he came from, who he was, and what happened to him. We don't know any of that, but what we do know is that he led a very, very well thought out campaign. He was very shrewd, very ruthless again. This letter, for example, is a letter where he asks Jonathan and Maspala, who are his right-hand men, to supply hadassim and itolgim to his soldiers so that they can carry out Chag Sukkot. And he ends the letter, as he always does, with a threat. If you don't do as I say, I'm going to break your arms, I'm going to break your legs, I'm going to come after you, I'm going to exact judgment from you, I'm going to hold you accountable. And he's a ruthless man, but on the other hand, we see this this adherence to Jewish law. He's making sure that everyone can keep the Shabbat and can keep the Chagim, and everyone does exactly as he say. But we know the end. A few Jews survived. This is Cassius Dio, a Roman source, who tells us that 50 of their most important fortresses and 985 of their better-known villages were razed to the ground. 580,000 were killed. As for the numbers who perished from starvation, disease, or fires, that was impossible to establish. Again, the degree of brutality that Judea received from Rome was unheard of. Judea, up until the first revolt, was perceived as a friend of Rome, an ally of Rome. They were Romanized, they were part of the empire, and the fact that they stood against and tried to free themselves from the Roman Empire was seen as the deepest form of betrayal, and the Romans exacted revenge. They were very, forgetting my English again, shitati. They were very thorough in their annihilation of any rebellion, in the quelling of the rebellion. We know that the Jews, those who were not killed, fled to the Judean desert, and this is a view of the Judean desert. They fled there in the year 135, 134, 135, and they took with them their most precious belongings, hoping to return back after the battles, and they never returned. Archaeologists found tens of caves which were used by the rebels. One of the most important caves is the Cave of Letters. That's where they found the letters of Bar Kokhba, and this is where they found a cache of documents which tell us the story of a woman called Babata, who is an amazing woman. She was married at least 3 times to leading members of the revolt, and the documents tell us a lot about her life and the way she led her life. And we know that she led her life just like any other Jew at the time, as a Roman. Some of the documents that she chose to bring with her were her ketubah, her marriage certificate, which were Roman. They were sealed in the Roman courts. She had custody wars with some of her ex-husbands for the children, again carried out in Roman courts in Arabia. She traveled to Petra, to Arabia, to have these custody cases. She has some of the documents we have pertain to her property. Again, all of these documents are Roman in style, but she was a Jew. She didn't go to the rabbis. She didn't go to the sages. She went to the courts, to the Roman courts. The material that she brought with her is exceptional. The fact that we have them is exceptional. This is all organic material. These are all the original artifacts that were found in the caves. You see here a basket, an original basket made from palm fronds. These are keys for the main door. You see here wooden bowls. These are actually imported from Rome. A jewelry box, a mirror. This is amazing. Glass bowls. I don't know how they managed to schlep these glass bowls all the way up to these caves, but they somehow did it. They don't have a scratch on them. They were wrapped in this beautiful mesh. These are interesting. These are, like I said, imported from Rome. They were manufactured in Rome. And if you see here on the handle, there's a figure. They were decorated. And what the Jews did, they kosherized. They made them kosher. They drew an X on the face, and this way they could continue using them. This is a patina. It's actually used for burning incense in pagan religion, and this was probably seized from a Roman soldier by one of the rebels. This is an original string, which was used for carrying this bronze platter. And these are obviously like I said, the keys for the main doors. So they locked the doors, which means they hoped to return home. But we know that the Roman legions set camps just above the openings to these cave shelters, and they either smoked them out or just waited for them to die of hunger. All of the bodies, or at least bodies, were found in these caves, so we know that most of the people who sought refuge there remained there. With this, hope of redemption died out. They weren't that optimistic, and everything we have from this point onwards is wishful thinking and nostalgia. What I brought here is a tombstone of a woman called Hannah. You can read here exactly what they wrote on her tombstone. And the interesting thing is that they, from this point onwards, start mentioning the date of the destruction. They start counting their time from the time of the destruction. So she died 69 years after the destruction of the temple, so that's 4th century, so that's into the Byzantine period. So everything we have post-destruction, post the Bar Kokhba destruction, is completely messianic, and this messianic hope wasn't realized until our time with the Zionistic movement, which led to the establishment of an autonomous Jewish state. Everything that happened in between is messianic, if you will. What I wanted to finish with, if we have time, do we have time, Gila? How are we on time?
Okay.
So what I wanted to finish with is actually an example of how post-destruction Judaism continued this idea of syncretism with Rome, and how they managed to maintain or to rebuild Jewish culture inside a Roman setting, which wasn't going anywhere. I brought here this quote from Val, which is actually a Roman historian, who says something which sounds very Jewish. For more than 170 years, the ancient Romans worshipped gods without icons. He's talking about the Etruscan culture, which is the early Roman culture. If this practice continued to this day, our belief in the gods would be stronger. Those who first set sculptures of the deities for men reduced reverence in their cities, since tasteless representations of the divine can easily arouse contempt. He's actually talking about aniconism. He's talking about representing gods as a way of degrading them. And he's talking about something which sounds very logical in Jewish eyes, or in a Jewish mindset. And it's something that existed in 2nd century Rome. Throughout Roman history, we have voices who speak of monotheism and who speak of aniconism as the preferred mode of a cult. It's not that they wanted to, they're obviously maintaining their pantheon, but in this period, in the 2nd century and onwards, mainly in the 2nd and 3rd century, we have these voices which sound very, very Jewish in a way. And there's obviously a sort of a polemic, there's a debate between Jewish philosophers and theologians with Roman ones. And they're adopting each other's view, and they're representing each other's view. This statue of Dionysus was found in Beit Shan, which was one of those mixed cities which had both Jewish and Roman citizens. And they found tens of these beautiful statues of Roman divinities, and many of them underwent iconoclasm. If you see, his face was completely smashed, his genitals were smashed, his arms and legs, probably they were just lost for technical reasons. But the iconoclasm is definitely the genitalia and the face. And the reason I brought this is because it's a wonderful example of the Jewish attitude to sculptures and how Jews tried to deal with sculptures and their physical setting. We know that Avodah Zarah, the Hilchot Avodah Zarah, the tenets of Avodah Zarah, the way we deal with icons, graven image, change in this time, in post-destruction period. it changes from a call for a complete destruction of statues, which is what we're supposed to do in first temple period and second temple period. And all of a sudden in the 2nd century, the rabbis say that we don't have to destroy the statues. We just have to make sure that that their divinity is destroyed. We can still enjoy them as statues, as art, as long as we don't see them, and as long as we make it very clear that we don't view them as deities, as gods. Romans themselves didn't always view a statue as a divine being. A statue which was worshipped was a very specific statue placed in a specific place. It was usually designated as an official cultic statue. But the way that the rabbis choose to show that they don't view a statue as a cultic statue is by using a Roman practice of damnatio memoria. When a Roman emperor was replaced by a new emperor, what they usually did was it's called damnatio memoria, damnation of his memory. They would damn his memory by removing all of his names from the statues, from the inscriptions. Any official inscription which had his name would be erased. His head would quite often be chopped off and replaced by the new emperor's head, or it would just be damaged, like we see here. So what the rabbis do is actually take this concept of damnatio memoria and use it in order to damn the memory, if you will, of the cultic aspect of the icon. And this is just one example of how post-Judaism tried to deal with Rome and with the Roman rule around them. That's it. That brings us to the end. Maybe we'll unmute everyone and open the floor for everyone who wants to add something or ask something.
Okay, so first of all, thank you very much. It was mamash מעניין. And yes, if people have questions or comments or something they want to revisit here, please, this is a great moment. Something you're not sure about, ideas, connections. There's a lot of thank yous in the chat. Okay.
I'll just say I was surprised to learn how thoroughly Romanized the civilization was in Judea at the time. So that was a new insight for me. Thank you.
Sure.
Okay. Yeah, and I think I just want to add here that I think because you were talking about, going away from images and going away from physical and going into theology, which is what Judaism likes doing, text and theology. But actually, I think for us, looking back at that period, it's extremely important to be able to see these physical artifacts, the statues, the bags, the keys, the hair, the whatever, to be able to fill in our understanding of our theology and our history. And Ken, Lauren, it's always amazing that you can write in such good Hebrew. Ken, I think it's really important for us to go back and look at these. That's why I'm so grateful for you being able to do this, give us this lecture. Ken, because we have it all, it's all very theoretical in our mind. We don't have the images, we just have the descriptions and the words. So this adds a lot of information into understanding who these people were, who these, we see the rabbis of the Mishnah and the people they talk about. about the Mishnah and earlier than the Mishnah, and they have a very specific understanding of their relationship with Rome. But when we see these artifacts, we see that it's much more complicated.
Yeah, and much more, I think, relatable to today. I think that what strikes me always, is how similar it is, and how we keep dealing generation after generation with the exact same question, the exact same fears. It's just a never-ending circle of kind of love and interest and violence and insecurity. And it's the same thing we have today with Judaism. I think that, again, this fear of assimilation and what it causes us to do, and the fear that outside nations have of Judaism and what we can do to them,
Yeah, I think we have a very sterile image sometimes of Judaism. And we were talking about the Churban before during the service and the destruction, and Judaism was never existed in a little cocoon. Judaism is always part of a wider culture and a very interesting relationship with wider culture. And when we see these artifacts, it just makes it way more clear and relatable, as you said.
yeah.
Speaking of connection to modern day times, I made a comment in the chat, but the keys that you showed of that Jewish woman reminded me very strongly of all of the Palestinians that I've seen who have held on to the keys to their homes that they were driven out of during the Nakba.
Yeah.
So that was very emotionally striking to me to see the resemblance.
Yeah. I mean, a refugee looks like a refugee. I mean, to me, it always reminds me of the sandals, the hair. It always takes me to the Shoah and to the Holocaust. But yeah, I mean, it takes us to any modern day war zone, and what life looks like in a war zone, and what refugees, what does a refugee decide to take with him when he knows that he may not be coming home? What are the most important things for him in life? The documents, the deeds.
Did they find any children's toys or anything in those caves? Were there any children's artifacts?
We know that there were children. They found a boy's shirt which had a talisman sewn into it.
Oh, it had a what?
Talisman sewn into the bottom part of the shirt. When they excavated it, they realized that the bottom part was sewn, and it had crystals and different herbs in it, sewn into it as a form of
kamea.
kamea.
Like a charm.
Charm. It didn't help them, but so that's the only reference we have for children. But we know that there were children in these caves because they found their remains, their bodies, but they didn't find any toys or no.
Rachel, your story about the woman for whom the documents were found was so eloquent. It really, I mean, a lot of the stories you told brought people back to life, and the photos just, as you say, it made it real that history and people and so much that was many centuries ago still is true today. Thank you.
Sure. Mm-hmm.
טוב, תודה רבה. Thank you very much.